Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by returning guest and Roman Catholic Louis Dizon, and he's going to be discussing new religious movements today. But let me first greet you and welcome you once again to the show. How are you?
H- Hello, I am doing quite well. It's finally starting to get warm, so
It is.
uh,
I don't know if you
yeah,
can tell, but I've been in the sun lately, so I'm a little red up here because of that.
yeah, I can start to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was I was biking outdoors just before this started,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I got my outdoor workout in.
Same
It
here. I
was
wasn't
great.
biking though. I was mainly walking and running. I do need to
Yeah,
bike though. That would be fun. But anyways, yeah,
yeah,
let's go ahead and
it's
get
a
to it.
yeah.
We're talking about new religious movements today. Before we begin to touch on any one in particular, let me just kind of ask you for an overall perspective. Could you maybe get us a rundown? What are some of the main
Sure.
characteristics of new religious movements?
Sure. So the word term new religious movement is a broad category to describe a number of religious phenomena that popped into the scene within the past couple hundred years. And the one thing that most of these new religious movements have in common is they're an offshoot of an older established religion, such as Christianity, but they don't really fit within the standard framework
Mm,
of what that religion is supposed to look like. So a lot of the new religious movements that we can think of will claim to be Christian, but they don't fit into the umbrella of either Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Protestantism. They are a different category all on their own, and they may deny one or more of the what we might consider the cardinal tenets of the Christian faith, and they might add in one or more extra elements that we would consider extraneous to the faith. And and there's a tendency to refer to these new religious movements as cults, quote unquote. Now, obviously, if you refer to any of these religious movements as cults, their adherents will become very upset. It's a pejorative term, and it's not a term that is useful to use when discussing with them. Also, the thing about cult is it's really hard to pin down exactly what that term means. It could be used as a synonym for heresy, but then from a Catholic perspective, pretty much every non-Catholic denomination is heretical in some sense or another.
right.
Like on the other hand, like the idea of a cult is also a highly authoritarian system of control. But that just begs the question: how authoritarian does a group have to be before we start considering it a cult?
Yeah.
Some, I'll give you an example. The Latter Day Saint movement is considered a cult, and they do have a bit of a hierarchical structure that we might consider authoritarian. But I don't know that it's any more authoritarian than the standard Roman Catholic authority structure. So if
Right.
that kind of authority structure is cultic, then so is traditional Christianity, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah, absolutely. It does. So, I mean, you really can't appeal to hierarchy because, I mean, that might work with a Baptist or somebody like that who doesn't really have a hierarchy. They may
Yeah,
be able to appeal to that. But again, like you said, traditional
yeah.
Christianity, that just doesn't slide.
Yeah, but that being said, there are some groups that are extremely controlling of its members. Like the classic example would be the Jehovah's Witnesses, who, their members are not allowed to read any outside literature at all, even if
Hmm.
it's just outside literature expounding what another group believes. So, and they also limit their contact with individuals from the outside.
Sure.
Contrast that with something like, again, Mormonism, which does not have such strictures, allows its members to read outside literature, allows its members to associate with other faiths, etc.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference there. But let me maybe ask you this. What's the difference between a new religious movement and maybe something a little bit older, such as Islam? Because those are, of course, they have heresies, if you will. So, is it just the fact that
I
it's
mean,
new rather than old? Is that the only characteristic here?
it's a difficult one because it's not entirely clear all the time where a spin-off of a one religion ends and a totally new religion begins. Like there were people in the early days of the inception of Islam who perceived Islam to be just another Christian heresy.
Right.
And I think that perception continued for a couple hundred years after Islam first arrived on the scene. You see John of Damascus, for example, in his work on heresies, will classify the Ishmaelite heresy among all the other groups that we know of, such as the Arians and the Nestorians. So part of it has to do with how old it is. Part of it also has to do with whether a group has sufficiently distinguished itself from the older established religions.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the case of Islam, it's pretty clear that they are a separate world religion because they have their own, holy book. They have their own self-designation. They don't try to pass themselves off as Christians. And they will, deny almost anything that we would consider a cardinal Christian tenet. Whereas a new religious movement might still hold on to some of those cardinal tenets. Like, for example, most of them will appeal to the Bible, at least to some extent.
But even Islam holds to some tenets of Christianity still. So I mean, there is
Sure.
very much a hard. There's a difficulty here in really trying to pin down the distinction. As you're kind of noting.
It is. There is a point where the edges start to blur.
Right.
But, it's like trying to get to the, get to the top of the mountain, right? And there's the base of the mountain, there's the peak of the mountain, and, there's all the spots along the way. But at a certain point, you can tell if you're closer to the peak or closer to the base.
Sure. Yeah, so there's kind of gradations to this thing. It's not just a clear black or white deal, though.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe talk about some specifically. I think we were going to discuss perhaps Mormonism in particular. Could you maybe give us an overview there?
Yeah, so I asked a bunch of my friends which new religious movement is the most interesting to them, and it seems that hands down the most of them wanted to hear about Mormonism. And I guess that has to do with a whole lot of factors. The fact that they're one of the most visible of the new religious movements. They're one of the most aggressively evangelistic, and it certainly helps that you had Kweku on this podcast a couple of months ago. So people had their exposure to Mormonism on this channel already.
Yeah.
And and it's a very interesting time for their religion as well, because I don't know how many of you know this, but this is the 200th anniversary of what Latter-day Saints refer to as the first vision. This is supposedly the pivotal moment where everything really starts to happen, because that's when God and Jesus reveal themselves to Joseph Smith and kick off the restoration of the gospel, as they would call it.
I mean, what kind of impact does that have on them now 200 years later? Is this just kind of, we're looking back on this and we're remembering, or is there something significant going on?
Well, among other things, the leaders of the LDS Church put out a proclamation, and a proclamation for them is basically their equivalent of a papal encyclical. And that proclamation is basically a rehashing of all the fundamentals of their religion, talking about the apostasy and the restoration and the the bringing about of the Book of Mormon as God's holy book for mankind in the latter days. So, and it's very interesting as well, given the fact that they seem to have ramped up a lot of their outreach this past year. So they've done a lot of rebranding. They have a new logo and everything, and
Why? I mean,
their
why rebrand
mission.
things? Why not keep them the way they are?
Um, well,
What was wrong with old
it has a
Mormonism?
Well, it has a lot to do with the current president, Russell Nelson. He is very keen on rearranging the furniture, so to speak. He's a little bit like Pope Francis in that
Yeah,
regard.
yeah,
One of the things that he explicitly told people in the church is not to use the word Mormon to
right,
refer to themselves.
right.
So from for the longest time, they had no problem self-identifying as Mormons. Like they even had a whole campaign to advertise themselves called "I'm a Mormon." Nowadays, their shtick is we are not Mormons, we are Latter-day Saints,
Hmm.
and we are not the Mormon Church. They don't even like using the acronym LDS Church. They will insist on using their full name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They really want the Jesus Christ part to be in there as well. So one of the other things you may have noticed is that their new logo has a picture of Jesus very prominently portrayed in it. Their old logo was an angel with a trumpet, which is
Is that
not
maybe
as.
to appeal more to evangelicals who are very much Christ-centered?
Yeah, I would say that is the case. They really want to play up their view that they're a Christian church just like the rest of us. We believe in Jesus, we believe in the Bible, all that good stuff.
Hmm.
And yeah,
But
and
do
they've been
they?
wrapping up their. Well,
Because
I I
I've
think
seen quite a few Mormons that seem to cast doubt on Scripture, at least the Bible. So do they
yeah,
really believe the
and
Bible?
that's a very interesting question. So there's a few things that are going on there. One is the fact that within their own articles of faith, there's a disclaimer that says they only believe in the Bible insofar as it is correctly translated, quote unquote. And
Okay.
what they mean by translation in that regard also involves transmission. So they do believe that there are certain things that were originally supposed to be in the Bible but got taken out of there. So they espouse a form of biblical corruption. And
Were the original autographs infallible for Mormons?
you know what? Infallibility and inerrancy are terms that we might use, but they generally don't use terms like that. Like
Hmm.
it's not in their vocabulary to speak of sorry, no, they will use inspired. They'll inerrant or infallible scriptures.
Yeah.
Like like they don't claim that about the Bible. Interestingly, they don't claim that about the Book of Mormon either. They'll say it's the most correct book on in all the earth, but they won't say that it's infallible. So
Even the
they
Book of
allow
Mormon, you're saying?
themselves just yeah, so they actually do allow themselves just a little bit of wiggle room to say that it might have errors. Like they're not going to explicitly say this or that thing is an error, but they will affirm in principle that inspired scripture can be errant. Yeah,
Okay.
and
Now they also have a couple
yeah,
more books in their canon. Are they considered
sure,
also?
yeah.
We don't know if they're infallible.
Well, I have here what they call the triple. So it's the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And these are
Hmm.
the additional scriptures that they believe in addition to the Bible.
Hmm.
I'm not aware that they claim errors for any specific section there. And I suppose theoretically they could, but they also believe that in the case of the Doctrine and Covenants, for example, that this is God directly telling Joseph Smith or some other prophet what his word is. So unless you want to say that God gives errant words to his prophets, then that's an issue that they'll have to contend with.
Now in their Bible, I imagine that is the canon that excludes the Deuterocanonicals. I believe I had a quad a while back, but I haven't. haven't looked through it or anything. So
Yes.
I imagine it's the Old Testament is the Protestant canon.
Yeah, they have the old. They more or less the same Bible Protestants have, with one little caveat. So this is something I found out recently, but there's actually an ongoing debate among Latter-day Saints as to whether or not the Song of Solomon should be in there.
Hmm.
Uh,
Because
and
that
the
was
reason
debated among the
why,
Jews.
that's part of it, but more to the point, there's a little note in the Joseph Smith translation, which is Joseph Smith's like corrected version of the King James version, where it
Hmm.
says that the Song of Solomon is not among the inspired writings.
Hmm.
So people will take their cues from that and say, well, Joseph Smith said it, so it must be the case. Although
Hmm.
not everyone agrees that Joseph Smith actually said this. And this is compounded by the fact that in their Bible study helps on their church website, it repeats this assertion, and it also repeats this. Sorry, it repeats the statements of one of their past church authorities, the Apostle Bruce McConkie, who basically referred to the Song of Solomon as biblical trash, quote unquote.
Hmm. So, and why is that? If actually Joseph Smith did say this, why would there be reservation on Song of Solomon? Is it because that there are perhaps some aspects to it that speak of physical intimacy?
Well, that's the explanation that most modern day Latter Day Saints have told me. So I asked a few of them, what do they think of this book? And more than a few of them says, well, some of the imagery there um, sounds pornographic, and we don't want pornographic imagery in our Bibles.
Mhm.
Which is funny because there's similar graphic language used in other books they accept, such as Ezekiel.
Right. Yeah, and to me, the passages that allegedly are pornographic never really strike me as necessarily being pornographic. It would just be more if you put that kind of spin on it, it might be. But at least that's
Yeah,
my interpretation.
yeah. It's funny because I'm familiar with this claim because my Muslim interlocutors say it all the
They're gonna bring
time
it up.
because they're always
Yeah,
trying to. Yeah, so they're gonna try to cast shade on the Bible by saying, "Look at the graphic imagery here."
yeah.
Um, Yeah. Of course, all of it has a point. God doesn't just randomly inspire the prophets to use graphic imagery unless it's meant to highlight something important, like a spiritual truth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, tell me a little bit more about Mormonism and maybe some of the concerns that you have with it in reference to it being a new religious movement.
Well, like I've been interested in Mormonism for the past few months. Like,
Hmm.
I did a little bit of digging on it, like further back than that, but it wasn't really that much in depth.
Yeah.
So what happened was, just to give the backstory, back in 2012, the summer of 2012, the some LDS missionaries from somewhere in the states were up here in Toronto, and I met up with them, and we were discussing doctrinal matters. And I think the reason I can remember it was 2012 is because I talked to them about Mitt Romney being the presidential candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had recently obtained this, and I was showing it to them, and I told them, I haven't really read it yet, but I would like to. So I started reading the Book of Mormon, and I got as far as the Book of Mosiah
Yeah.
while I was speaking to them before basically we ended our contact because they felt that they weren't getting through to me.
Hmm.
Although, by that point I had invested quite a bit of time researching into them. They gave me a copy of their Gospel Principles Manual, and I attended church a couple of times with them.
Hmm.
And then, I shelved the whole matter and I didn't really look into Mormonism anymore for another 8 years. So what happened recently was that a couple of LDS missionaries started to appear in some interfaith events that were happening at the University of Toronto. And I was, I was interested in what they were doing there. I don't usually see LDS missionaries at U of T. So, I struck up conversations with them. I got their contact information. And then the coronavirus came and shut everything down. So we continued our discussions through video chat. And
Okay.
it was around this time that they had their most recent general conference. And it was around that same time that the conversation between yourself and Kwaku happened.
Mhm.
And, I thought this was an interesting confluence of events. And that pushed me to start looking more into the LDS faith. And as you may know, I started a group called Catholics and Latter-day Saints on Facebook, where adherents of both faiths can dialogue and discuss what they have in common, what they differ on, and which one makes the more sense.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up question about something that you mentioned kind of there in passing. You said that you had attended the Mormon Church a few times, but you just kind of, put
Yeah.
down the Book of Mormon. What exactly made you lose interest in it?
Well, the thing with LDS missionaries is like my experience with them, they're only really interested in talking to you as long as they feel that they have a chance of converting you. So the moment they feel that, they're not going to win me over, they decide, this isn't really worth our time. We're going to just, have to agree to disagree. So that happened towards the end of that summer, and after that, I decided, well, they're not going to talk to me anymore. I have no reason to visit their church, so I'm just going to shelve this whole thing and get back to the other stuff I'm concerned with.
So I take it there wasn't much that you had read so far in the Book of Mormon that really compelled you. I asked because when I started reading through the Book of Mormon, and there's no disrespect here intended for Mormons, but I found it terribly boring. I could not make it through it. Same
Yeah.
with the Quran. I could not just. I found it so terribly boring that I just could not make
Yeah.
myself finish it. So
Uh, well, the thing with a lot of Latter-day Saints that I talk to is they say that if you read the Book of Mormon and you do it while praying with a sincere heart,
okay,
it will eventually convince us of its truthfulness. So I went
right.
the whole 9 yards. I prayed the prayer that's in Moroni chapter 10 that they suggest. I've actually done it twice, and
Hmm.
I've done that as I'm reading through the Book of Mormon.
Hmm.
And yes, it is a little hard to read through. It's quite prosaic,
Yeah.
and in order to get through it, what I have done is I started playing a Book of Mormon audio that I found, and I will play it at double speed just so I can get through material faster,
Hmm.
and I will read along with the text as that audio is playing. I found that helps me to get through material faster. um, you know. But yes, without those kinds of aids, it's really hard to, read through this for an extended period of time.
Indeed. Well, okay. So, what are some of the other perhaps theological impediments that you have, in why you didn't go to Mormonism? I mean, maybe let's perhaps start with
Uh,
the claim that there was a great apostasy. What is your problem
yeah.
with that claim?
Well, here's a funny thing. I was Protestant at the time I was talking to these missionaries, and when you're a Protestant, it becomes harder to argue against the great apostasy. But because Protestantism has an implicit doctrine of a great apostasy in it, whether Protestants admit it or not. Be that as it may, as a Catholic, it became much clearer to me that this really is one of the great differences between Catholicism and all of the new religious movements, because all of them, at some level, claim a great apostasy.
Right.
So they will try to claim that the original Christian faith that the apostles preached went off the rails at some early point in history. Like,
Hmm.
which point in history depends on who you talk to, but it'll be always be at some point between the death of the last apostles and Constantine. Constantine's the big bad guy that everyone likes to pile up on. Um, like some people will go as early as like the immediate generation
Yeah.
after the apostles. And this is where I'm going to mention Kwaku again, because he
Mm-hmm.
did put out a video on the Great Apostasy. And if you
Mm-hmm.
watch that video, he makes the argument that the early church fathers in the second century were already talking about an apostasy taking place in their day. Well, if that's the case, then it started happening really early on, because he mentions figures like Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, Hegesippus. These are all people living in the second century. Spoiler alert, all of the quotes are taken out of context, and if you read my rebuttal to it, I show why that's the case. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but if that's the case, then, that's evidence that in order to believe in one of these new religious movements, you pretty much have to claim a very early apostasy. Because, as you and I both know, very distinctly Catholic elements start popping up early
Sure.
on.
Oh
So
yeah.
you can't claim that a pure, uncorrupted church existed in the third or the fourth century, and at the same time argue against Catholic beliefs such as the real presence or the episcopate that were already present at the time.
Yeah, neither can you really read the church fathers, not just, bits and pieces, but actually read their, the entire corpus of perhaps a figure like Justin or Irenaeus or somebody like that. You can't read these ante-Nicene fathers and come away thinking that they believed in some kind of great apostasy that was taking place in their day.
Oh, for sure. Like, there's no conception of a great apostasy in any of their writings. Like, the common theme that runs through most of the patristic writings is that God has preserved the true church through apostolic succession.
It's a big
You
one.
have the succession lists in Irenaeus and in Tertullian and others. So they're saying, you know what? The true church is still around, and how you know the true church is still around is they can trace their lineage back to the original apostles, which
That's a
is
big
something that all
argument.
of the
Yeah.
heretical groups, yeah. So, you know,
Even
um,
Irenaeus brings that up, of course, in his Against Heresies, the 5 books, and he hammers that away because he's refuting the
yeah.
Gnostics who are claiming to have the true teaching of Jesus, and he says, "Well, wait, this doesn't make sense because we have churches that were established by the apostles, and bishops, our bishops go all the way back to the apostles, and this isn't what was
Yeah.
handed down to us."
Yeah. So the early church fathers did do us a great favor by leaving behind their writings, so we can always appeal to what they wrote as evidence that, all of these new religious movements are spouting nonsense when they claim an apostasy took place.
Yeah. Now there's always those voices like we had, Dr. Bart Ehrman on the other day, and it's a book
Yeah.
interview, so there's not a whole lot of an opportunity to give a response. But he and many others from different views and backgrounds will say that, okay, well, maybe you have some of these church fathers saying that, but that doesn't get you back to Jesus. At best, that gets you
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, 5 steps away from Jesus. So what would you say in response to that? The Mormon who tries
Well,
to say,
again,
well, these church fathers were already apostate.
Well, again, you know, we can go back to the scriptures. We can take a look at what the text of the Bible says and reason with them through that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, they will still accept this as an authoritative source,
Mm-hmm.
even if they say it's not perfect. And by the way, I am quoting. I'm holding up here my Greek New Testament. So they say we believe in the Bible insofar as it's correctly translated. Well, why even rely on a translation? We have the original languages right here, and we can
Yeah.
appeal to that.
Yeah, yeah, but aren't they going to say, "Look, that text is corrupt"? I mean, look at these biblical scholars who are atheists and agnostics. They're saying that your New Testament has been corrupted textually.
Now, here's the funny thing. How Latter-day Saints in particular go about asserting textual corruption is a little bit different from how Muslims go about it.
Mm-hmm.
So with Muslims, for example, they will say that, yeah, widespread corruption took place, massive changes happened.
Mm-hmm.
They might say that certain books that we consider canonical were never meant to be canon in the first place. They will
Mm-hmm.
reject the Apostle Paul, for example. like Mormons are a little bit more conservative than that, in that they'll affirm all of the books of the Bible, at least the Protestant Bible, with the possible exception of the Song of Solomon, are inspired, and they think that some corruption took place, but it's not like widespread corruption. Like the main places where they think corruption took place are the places where Joseph Smith introduces proposed textual changes in his translation.
Okay. And is there
I don't know if
evidence
you've
to
ever
back
read.
that up?
It depends on your a priori acceptance of Joseph Smith, because the kinds of corrections he proposes in the Joseph Smith translation have no basis in any manuscript of the Old or New Testaments that have been preserved to us. Like, I'll give you an example. In Genesis chapter 50, the Joseph Smith translation inserts a very long, prophecy about a future prophet whose name will be Joseph, surprise, and he will come and restore the truth. Now, I happen to have my copy of the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia here, and the critical apparatus in the end of the book of Genesis mentions all of the variants that exist in all the different manuscripts that we have, and lo and behold, nothing there about a long inserted prophecy.
But of course, they're going to come back and say, especially with the Old Testament, you're dealing with majority of, unless we're talking about Dead Sea Scrolls here, most of your stuff is coming from way later, 9th century onward, if I'm not mistaken. What
Well,
would you say to those who say, but the very texts that you're using are unreliable?
well, it's funny you should mention Dead Sea Scrolls, because we do have a copy of Genesis preserved in there,
Right.
and we also have the copies of Genesis that are preserved not only in the Masoretic text, but also the
Yep.
Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and a wide variety of early translations, such as the Verus Latina. And we can compare all of them and find that, the textual variants tend to be extremely minor. There's nothing at the level of a massive prophetic insertion, such as what Joseph Smith claimed.
Well, what about Jeremiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls? Isn't it pretty truncated, actually, when we look at
Yes,
it?
yes.
So what if they say,
It's
well,
funny.
okay, your Jeremiah is corrupt, clearly, so maybe your
Yeah,
Genesis matches what they had back then during the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that doesn't mean it matched what Moses had.
yeah. So here's the funny thing about Jeremiah, right? First of all, I don't know that any Latter-day Saint will go this route, but I wouldn't discount the possibility that some of them might. I know that some Muslims have gone this route before. Jeremiah has the largest textual variance of any book of the Bible. The Septuagint version is 1800 verses shorter. And the Dead Sea Scrolls version matches the Septuagint version. And if you look at the differences between the Masoretic version and the Septuagint version, a lot of those 1800 verses have to do with repetitions of existing material.
Okay.
So something that is mentioned in one place and repeated elsewhere in the Masoretic text, it's only mentioned once in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint / Dead Sea Scroll version of Jeremiah tries to go for brevity. So
Yeah.
it mentions only the stuff that, it mentions all of the core things, and then if something is repeated, it doesn't repeat it. Now, there's some question about which came first, and there are 3 theories, okay? The first theory is that the shorter Septuagint version came first, and the Masoretic version is a longer, expanded recension of that. The second theory is that the Masoretic version, the longer one, came first, and then the Septuagint version is a shortening of that. And the third theory, which is that Jeremiah wrote both of them. He wrote a short version, and then he wrote a long version, and somehow both versions have been preserved in our textual record. Now, me personally, I don't really have I don't consider any of those theories a hill to die on.
Hmm.
I think that at face value, because scribes have a tendency to expand things rather than contract them, the Septuagint version has a greater chance of being the authentic text. But
Hmm.
I'm also equally amenable to the idea that maybe Jeremiah wrote both of them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So you would say overall, look, even though Jeremiah might be shorter in some of the manuscripts that we encounter, this is just, in reference to things that are repeated, repetition. So the content is not really truncated.
Yeah, yeah. So like, if you read the shorter version of Jeremiah, as found in Septuagint, um, some things might not be as emphasized, and certain passages might be found somewhere else in the book. But in
Mm,
terms of like doctrinal content, you're not missing anything.
not miss anything. Good. Okay. So, that answers the issue there of the Old Testament. But as far as the New, kind of bridging the gap between what the apostles actually said or what Jesus actually said, and then what we actually have in the church fathers, there is somewhat of a gap there. How do we know that the things that the church fathers were testifying to actually does go back to what Jesus actually said, not just your NA 28. I guess that's 28 or 29th edition, whichever one it is.
This is the UBS for.
Oh, that's USBS. I'm
This is
sorry.
UBS for.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I
Yeah.
do have
So
an NA28
yeah,
here.
there it is. Either way, whatever your textual critical apparatus is, whatever you have there, maybe some of the stuff that the church fathers said goes back to those, but how do you know that actually goes back to Jesus and what the apostles said, and that there's not maybe a gap where they perhaps taught things that were in Mormonism later, but it was
Yeah.
corrupted.
Now, here's the thing. So, anyone who studies textual criticism knows that there's a principle called lectio brevior. And the idea behind lectio brevior is the shorter reading is more likely to be the authentic reading.
Right.
So, the classic examples of that are the longer ending of Mark, the woman caught in adultery, and the Johannine comma. There are some questions about whether these are part of the original, and based on the principle of lectio brevior, because scribes have a tendency to add things rather than remove them, these are considered more not part of the original text. I'm not saying whether this is the case or not. I'm just saying this is the standard view among textual critics.
Sure.
Now, if you look at the view espoused by Latter-day Saints, it is that things were taken out of the scriptures. So it's the opposite of what textual criticism says. Textual criticism tells us that an originally shorter text was expanded with additions. Mormonism teaches that an originally longer text was truncated by having plain and precious truth removed from it.
So they would say that the original text actually had Mormon truths in them. It was just later on taken out. What about what if a Mormon said, well, maybe the New Testament text didn't contain these Mormon truths, but the things that would be taught by Christians over and against Mormon teachings, those were added to the New Testament text. If you get what I'm saying here.
Yeah, I sort of do. In fact, let me see, the January 2020 edition of the Ensign magazine makes that exact claim. So let me just quote it from their magazine.
Sure.
So it says, in a vision, Nephi saw that many of the teachings in the Bible would be changed over time, but that God would prepare a way for those truths to be restored. And here are the four specific teachings that it mentions. 1, the fall of Adam and Eve was a part of the Heavenly Father's plan. Number 2, we existed as spirits before this life, learning and preparing for mortality. Number 3, Christ visited the people of the ancient Americas and established his church there. Number 4, baptism is not needed for infants because they are not yet accountable. So, according to the Ensign magazine, these are truths that were originally part of the Bible but got taken out of it.
Well, now let me ask this then. What do Mormon scholars do about some of these inconsistencies and some of the refutations that you've been providing? surely they're aware of these refutations. Surely they're well educated and great intellects. What do they say in response?
Yeah, you know what? The funny thing is, the only time that I have heard an LDS apologist tackle the issue of biblical corruption in depth is, I think it may have been Daniel Peterson or some other big shot LDS apologist doing a um, presentation on textual problems in the Bible, and to my knowledge, they more or less just recapitulate the arguments put forth by Bart Ehrman. So,
Yeah,
if you've already read Bart Ehrman, you're not going to hear anything new.
right. I gotcha. Yeah, because one of the
Mm.
things that I thought was interesting in the Kwaku interview, for example, there was a lot of things that I thought were problematic with what he was saying. But again, it's kind of a interview, so not necessarily a time to start debating the guy. But he had, for
Mhm.
example, he was talking about what is the book? The book of the one with Abraham.
Ah, yes, the Book of Abraham, part of the
Yeah, the
Pearl of
Book
Great
of
Price.
Abraham, and of course, it's allegedly written in Reformed Egyptian. And he was quoting different scholars who were saying, there's actually Egyptologists out there who back this thing up, and they say that actually, Joseph Smith was translating something legitimate. This really did go back to
Yeah.
ancient times. What do you say in response to stuff like that?
There's, as far as I know, two theories that are going around in LDS apologetic circles about how to harmonize the Book of Abraham with the funerary scroll it was supposedly translated from.
Hmm.
Um, so the first theory, which is the older of the two theories, is that part of the funerary scroll was lost, and that lost part is what contained the text of the Book of Abraham.
Okay,
So it's rather convenient
sure.
that Joseph Smith translated this thing from a funerary scroll, but the part he actually translated disappeared, and the only part that got preserved for us is the part that he didn't translate. But
Okay.
there's a problem with that explanation. So I don't know if the newest edition of the Pearl of Great Price still has this, but in my version, which was published in the 80s, it has facsimiles. So it'll have illustrations such as this one, where it
Yeah,
has
yeah.
images from the scroll, and it has the description of what it's supposed to mean. And as far as I know, these images are part of the text that survived. And even if it didn't, we can always look at this and study this. And of course, Egyptologists have looked at this text, and they've given the correct interpretation of what the facsimiles are supposed to mean, and the correct interpretation is completely different from what Joseph Smith gave.
Yeah, I used to do
Mm.
just kind of for fun hieroglyphs, and I think I remember looking at that very facsimile that you were referencing there, one of those, and it wasn't adding up to me. Now again, I'm not an expert in hieroglyphs, so hey, I could be wrong, but I wasn't seeing any consistency. So
Yeah. So so I should mention this. So a lot of LDS apologists today realize that trying to connect the funerary scroll with the Book of Abraham is a lost cause, so they don't
okay.
try it anymore. So what they do instead is another theory, which is much more recent in origin, and I
Hmm.
find it very interesting,
Hmm.
to say the least. And it's the theory is that Joseph Smith thought he was translating the funerary scroll, but he wasn't actually translating it. He was actually being given revelation of a completely different book,
Okay.
which is the Book of Abraham, and the funerary scroll which he had in front of him just happened to be like
Okay.
the means by which God used to stimulate Joseph's mind in order
The
to produce this
Sure.
text.
I
Now,
mean,
I
hey,
think like, if you go on, yeah,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure this is the theory that Kwaku holds to. Um, he has a video defending the Book of Abraham on his YouTube channel, and he states this precise theory. And he says, you should not look to the funerary scroll for confirmation of the text of the Book of Abraham. Instead, there are other ways to show that it's authentic.
Look, hey, it's possible, but this is entirely, unfalsifiable. You can't you can't prove this wrong when you use arguments like that. There's no way to falsify something like that, which I think is problematic, because then I could just say anything. I could just make up whatever I want at that point.
Yep. So, as one person has pointed out, if you resort to explanations like this, then, the form of revelation that God is giving to Joseph, it looks, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from outright fraud.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, at this point, if I really can't objectively verify this thing, I can just make up anything and say, hey, God just told me, Just kind of like the charismatics, a lot of times when they just wake up and say, well, God told me today. I could just say, hey, well, God told me, and here's a new a sequel to the Book of Mormon. And, hey, you take it or leave it,
Yeah, that's the thing with a lot of the claims being made by these new religious movements. Ultimately, they know that they can't prove what they're saying is true, so they will ask you to suspend disbelief in, accepting their claims.
Okay, I mean, it's one thing for me to dispense disbelief. It's another for me to accept it and believe in it. So I could say, okay, well, I'm going to suspend disbelief, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to assent to this thing either. So that really doesn't get us to where they want us to go.
Yeah, here's the thing. Like, I'm sure you've interacted with enough Calvinists to hear about presuppositionalism. So
sure.
It's all down to first principles. So if you a priori presuppose that the LDS worldview is correct and that Joseph Smith is a prophet, then all of these explanations can make sense. You can make sense of God not
absolutely
giving concrete historical evidence for any of the revelations he gives, and he just wants you to take everything on faith. It's not particularly helpful.
Well, one of the reasons
outsider looking in. So.
Indeed, and one of the reasons why I went with historical Christianity over something like Mormonism is because one is much more objectively reliable. I'm not saying that faith isn't needed in Christianity, but I think I can verify Christian claims a lot more historically and objectively than I can Mormon claims. Maybe I'm wrong, but just based on what I've seen, one is more verifiable.
Yeah, so actually, if I could say a little bit about my testimony.
Go ahead.
So there was a point in time that I was an atheist agnostic. Okay, I was 16 years old. I read Richard Dawkins. I was highly impressionable. And, I didn't really know any better. But I was very much interested in this idea of, trying to verify the truth claims of specific religions. And at the time, the only thing that I was really interested in was Christianity. So I didn't really think about Islam or Mormonism or any other religion. I was just looking at the Christian faith. I was looking at the Bible, and I was trying to find evidences for and against the Bible. So I read Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, and the thing that one of that book really hit home for me is that Christianity claims to be a historical religion, that it names real persons, real places. It has this paper trail of ways that you can verify it. Even if you leave for aside all of the extra biblical testimonies from individuals such as Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius, etc., just look at what the biblical authors claim. right? So you look at Second Peter chapter 1 verse 16, where St. Peter says that we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we revealed this to you, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So St. Peter emphasizes the fact that he's an eyewitness of the things that he mentions. And then you have St. John in his first epistle saying, what we have seen, what we have heard, we have touched with our own hands concerning the word of life. This is what we pass on to you. So, and then the other dimension of that is prophecy. So they will quote Old Testament. They will point to messianic prophecies such as Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and Micah chapter 5. And they will say, these things are true because these scriptures that were written hundreds of years before they happened testify that this is something that will happen. And we see the fulfillment of them in our own day.
Let me shift gears a little bit here and maybe ask you, are there any parallels between Mormonism and Islam in your estimation, since you're an expert in Islam? So from what you've seen, are there parallels?
Everyone asks me this question, are they the same? For what it's worth, Joseph Smith did intentionally try to pattern himself after Muhammad. Like, there is a quote attributed to him where he basically says that I am a Muhammad for the Americas, and the Book of Mormon is the Al-Quran for this people. So, it's not just other people finding parallels between the two. It's Joseph Smith himself creating the parallels. And there are a lot of things.
Is that authentic? Does that actually go back to Joseph Smith?
I'll have to double check the exact source. So it's a good question. I don't know for sure, but it's a quote that I have seen pop up many times. So it's worth investigating.
Sure.
But leaving that aside, there are a lot of similarities. So both Joseph Smith and Muhammad claim to have received revelations from an angel. Okay, so where does Muhammad get the Quran? You have the angel Gabriel coming down and revealing those verses to him, and making him recite them. How does Joseph Smith get the Book of Mormon? Well, the angel Moroni leads him to the place where the plates were buried in Hill Cumorah. So in both cases, you have the angel leading the prophet to the revelation and causing him to disseminate that revelation to the masses. Now, interestingly, this is a much more recent realization for me, but it is also the case that the way Muslim apologists and LDS apologists argue for the respective holy texts is very similar. If you read the Quran, its claim for itself is that this is the most eloquent of all literature. Like, no one can produce a verse that is as wonderful and as majestic as this. And this eloquence is how you know that this is the word of God. If you listen to LDS apologists, they will say that, well, there is a level of complexity in the Book of Mormon that could not have come out of Joseph Smith's mind. Like, you look into the verbal allusions and the parallels and the complex literary structures, the chiasms, and, there's no way that an uneducated farm boy could have had the wherewithal to produce such a sophisticated text. So the answer is that it must have come from the mind of someone other than Joseph Smith.
But when I read both, I guess I don't come away with with that impression. What exactly is the response to somebody like me, at least for Mormons? Is it because I'm not doing so prayerfully? Well, what about yourself? You did so prayerfully and weren't convinced. What do they say about people like you and I?
There's the charitable response and the less charitable response. Which one do you want to hear first?
Whichever you want.
Okay, the more charitable Latter-day Saints will say that, well, maybe you're just not ready for it yet. God is preparing
Okay.
you to come to that realization, but you're not at the point where you're prepared to accept it. So
Okay.
you just need to keep reading on
Sure.
until God hits you with that
Yeah.
realization.
Right.
The less charitable response is to basically question your sincerity. Well,
Sure.
any sincere person must come to the conclusion that this is the word of God, and the fact that you have not come to this conclusion yet is evidence that you are not sincere, even if you say you are.
But everybody can claim that. Mormons,
Oh
I'm
yeah,
sorry, Muslims can claim that. Anyone can say that, well, you haven't sincerely looked into this. Christians can say that. Buddhists, I
yeah.
suppose, coming from a very different perspective, might be able to
I,
say that.
I mean,
In other words, everybody in the world could say something like that. So that really doesn't do anything for me, I
yeah.
guess.
And it's not just that, but is God really that dependent on our sincerity? Like, I was a very
Hmm.
anti-Catholic Protestant for years before I rejoined the church, and I fought the church every step of the way. But God was not
Hmm.
hindered by that. He was still able to win me back to the Catholic faith,
Hmm. Yeah.
right?
Well, for me, I need something a little bit more objective, and so far I haven't seen anything that would back up this notion of a great apostasy. But if I were able to see that, I would have to first consider Islam before I would consider Mormonism, because Islam just predates it. So for me, I would have to go there way before I ever deal with Mormonism. What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard to judge between the two books, between the Quran and the Book of Mormon. I don't know which one has a better chance of being true. Um, Actually, um, this might upset any Muslims listening, but I think in a couple of places the Book of Mormon might even have the better chance at being correct than the Quran.
Hmm.
Um,
And
like
how come?
the so one level is falsifiability. So like the Book of Mormon is at least marginally more susceptible to being verified or falsified than the Quran is, because the Quran has no geographic references whatsoever. Well, not entirely
Hmm.
true. There's like one ambiguous reference to Mecca and one or two references to Jerusalem, but it doesn't really go out of its way to mention places.
Hmm.
And so it's very difficult to place um, the
Yeah.
Quran's retelling of events in a concrete context. And you largely have to rely on secondary literature such as the Hadith for that. With the Book of Mormon, it mentions a whole bunch of places such as Zarahemla, the land bountiful, Nahom, and at the very least, like you could make a case that this or that location somewhere in the world might be that place. Like it's not a slam dunk that this is that place, but you could make a reasonable case for it. Um, that's one area where it is possible that the Book of Mormon has a better case going for it than the Quran. The other place where you might have a better case for the Book of Mormon and the Quran, well, actually, it's not really the Book of Mormon, but it's in the Doctrine and Covenants. One Latter day Saint pointed something out to me that I thought was pretty interesting, actually. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 87, there is a prophecy of the Civil War that is given by Joseph Smith in 1932, a full 3 decades before it happened. And it gets, interesting enough, a couple of details correct. So, just quoting the first verse, "Verily, thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls." Well, so far so good. That sounds like what actually happened in history. So you got to give him credit for getting that right. Where it goes off the rails is if you keep reading on to the rest of the prophecy, because it then goes on to say that slaves will rise up against their masters. That didn't happen. Other nations will get involved in this war, which did not happen, and that this will bring about the end of the age. Again, this did not happen. But the fact that it got as much right as it did is actually a better track record than what you get with the Quran, which has at best one really vague reference to the Byzantines winning a battle in Surat Ar-Rum. And that one is way too vague to be given much credence. So at least at the area of prophecy, Mormonism slightly edges it out over Islam.
Are there any claims any additional claims as far as historical places and things like that that perhaps back up the Mormon position?
Okay, there is one that I want to do some more digging into this because it's also fascinating to me. In First Nephi chapter 8, verses 8 and 9, it says this. And it came to pass that he called the name of the river Laman, and it emptied into the Red Sea, and the valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof. And when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, O that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into this fountain of all righteousness. Now, for many decades, critics of the Book of Mormon poked fun at this passage, saying, there's no river that runs down into the Red Sea. If you look at the Book of Mormon Central, which is another apologetics website, they have a series of articles pointing to a specific geographical feature in the Arabian Peninsula. I believe it's called Wadi al-Ism, and it's this like empty gully that it's dry most of the year, but when large amounts of rainfall fall into that specific place, that dry gully fills up with water, and it turns into a raging torrent that streams down into the Red Sea. And they even have videos of some of those rainy seasons where that gully fills up and it flows down into the Red Sea. And they say, this is confirmation that the River Laman did exist after all. Now, it's not entirely satisfactory to me, and I'll tell you why. There's a difference between a wadi and a river, okay? And the difference between a wadi and a river has to do with whether it is continually flowing or not. A river is generally a continually flowing body of water. It will occasionally dry up in particularly bad droughts, but by default, it's constantly flowing. A wadi, on the other hand, is generally a dry valley that might occasionally start flowing with water, but it only flows with water in rainy seasons. Like by default, it is dry, it is empty of water. And in the Bible, a wadi and a river are explicitly distinguished from one another. There are many references to wadis in the Bible. So the Hebrews knew the difference between a wadi and a river. So if the River Laman is actually conveying to us that this is a wadi, then it's doing a really bad job of doing so.
Okay. Let me ask you one more thing, kind of shifting gears, but briefly before we get to chat questions. Can you maybe talk to us about Seventh-day Adventism? Is it a new religious movement, or is it a breakaway from Christianity? How would you describe it?
Yeah, okay, so Seventh-day Adventism is, I would argue that it is a new religious movement, but it's a perfect example of why a new religious movement cannot be classified necessarily as a cult. The general consensus amongst most Christians today, Catholic and Protestant, is that Seventh-day Adventism is a Christian denomination, not a cult. However, if you look at the origins of Seventh-day Adventism, it has many of the classic elements that we would associate with cults. Like it is something that came about in the 1840s after what is known as the Great Disappointment. So an evangelical preacher named William Miller claimed that the world would end in 1844. That didn't happen. It's called the Great Disappointment. But many of the people who followed him, who were called Millerites, didn't really give up. So instead of instead of saying that the end of the world was supposed to happen in 1844, they just reinterpreted the prophecy. And the groups that would eventually coalesce and become the Seventh Day Adventists came up with a doctrine that is called investigative judgment. So this is their creative reinterpretation of William Miller's end of the world prophecy. They say that what actually happened in 1844 was that Christ entered into the Holy of Holies. So, previously he was in the outer court of the heavenly tabernacle, and now he's entered the Holy of Holies. And this initiated a period of investigative judgment where God is unfurling the record books, as it were, and looking into the lives of all the believers dead and alive to determine whether they are fit to enter into paradise. And that judgment is going on up to today. It will continue until Christ returns. Seventh-day Adventism is based on the prophecies of Ellen G. White, who was one of those Millerites who followed William Miller. And she claimed to be a prophet, and she made many predictions during her lifetime and claimed a lot of visions as well. And classical Seventh-day Adventism claimed that Ellen G. White is one of the truest interpreters of the Bible, and that you should look to her writings as your source for correct Bible interpretation. Interestingly, a lot of Seventh-day Adventists today have softened their position on these distinctives, and a lot of them do not have that prominent role for Ellen G. White that classical Adventism has. So they will de-emphasize Ellen G. White. They will de-emphasize their differences with mainstream Christian denominations. And for the most part, they have successfully reinvented themselves. So Seventh-day Adventism in practice nowadays is mostly just another Protestant denomination that happens to meet on a Saturday instead of a Sunday. But in their origins and their early history, they were much more distinct.
They have Trinitarian baptisms, correct?
Yes, so they baptize in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. They affirm the doctrine of Trinity, at least most of them do. My understanding is there are some splinter factions of Adventists who deny the Trinity, but the main Seventh-day Adventist denomination affirms the Trinity.
Want to get to some chat questions here. This one is kind of tongue-in-cheek. From Adam. Lewis, why won't you repent and accept Joseph Smith?
Well, according to the LDS missionaries that I've spoken to, I'm just not in a position to do that yet. That God will not demand for me more than I'm capable of handling, and that at the right time, if I'm being truly sincere, I'm eventually gonna do that. Eventually. That's assuming that some other group, such as the Muslims or the Eastern Orthodox or the Lutherans, doesn't get to me first.
Right. This one is from DB Coop. Did Smith or early Mormons engage with the Church Fathers at all, or were they just ignorant of history?
Okay, so there is one book that I should mention. So there's a book by James Talmage, who was an important theologian of the Mormon Church during its early years, and he wrote a book called The Great Apostasy. And this is where he tries to lay out a historical case for the Great Apostasy happening. So he will go into the early history of the church, and he will point to aberrations and corruptions that were happening during that early period in order to show that, hey, look, at this point in time, the apostasy was already taking place. So they are not ignorant of church history. Some of their more erudite scholars do attempt to engage with the church fathers. But just as with Protestants, it's usually only the professional apologists and theologians who do that. The rank and file are largely ignorant of these writings.
Okay. This one is from Emmanuel. Do Mormons and Christians worship the same God?
This is going to be a categorical no for me. Like I think that their doctrine of God is much different than any um, group that calls itself Christian. At least in the case of Protestants, for example, we have a shared commitment to the doctrine of the Trinity. Um, and you know, a lot of other central cardinal beliefs regarding the nature of God. And also, another very important thing is we accept their baptism. The Catholic Church has an official position paper on the Vatican website saying that LDS baptisms are invalid, and it actually cites their different doctrine of God as evidence for this. And I think that if their baptism is invalid on account of their different doctrine of God, it stands to reason that that the God that they worship is not the God that we worship.
Now I know it's invalid, but do they still baptize in the with the Trinitarian formula?
Yes, they do. So they do baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
It's
It's just
primarily the intentions.
right,
So as you know, in Catholic sacramentology,
right,
the intention of the minister can make or break the validity of the sacrament, and
right.
they do have something that is completely different in their underlying intentions when they do baptism, and it's some of those underlying differences that cause their baptism to be considered invalid from a Catholic standpoint.
Let me ask a part B to that same question. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Since we've been talking
I
so much
think
about Islam.
we. I think you asked me the same question. Um,
Did I? I don't
in
recall.
Yeah. So last year when I came on here to discuss Islam, you asked me the same question, and
I don't
my
recall.
answer to that is, you know, it's complicated
Hmm.
because the Catechism says that we do, but that part of the Catechism is one that Catholics will not necessarily agree with.
Right.
Um, So, I guess it largely depends. Do you consider that part of the catechism, which I think also cites Lumen Gentium,
Hmm.
I believe?
Hmm.
So, um, you can accept what Lumen Gentium says, or you can, reject it on that particular issue.
Hmm. This one is from
Yeah.
Shane. Can you dive into Jehovah's Witnesses a little bit?
All right. So, yeah, I actually have a little bit of experience with Jehovah's Witnesses as well, and that primarily has to do with the fact that I think it was the summer of 2009. I was still Protestant at the time. I was going to an Alliance church, and one of the members of the Alliance church that I was going to was being harassed by Jehovah's Witnesses. They gave her a book called, let me pull it up. What Does the Bible Really Teach? This is the book that Jehovah's Witnesses give to inquirers as the introduction to their beliefs. Oh, sorry, I'm holding it backwards, I think. There we go. So the Jehovah's Witnesses gave that lady a copy of this book, and the lady didn't want to read it, so she passed it on to me. So I read through it, and I went and took notes as I did, and this gives the basic rundown of what they believe. And I was running into Jehovah's Witnesses on my own at the same time, so I started, becoming interested in them, and I was digging into their history and stuff. So Jehovah's Witnesses are a group that can much more easily be considered a cult because of the way they conduct themselves. It started off as like a Bible study movement called the Bible Students, started by Charles Taze Russell in the 1870s. This is part of the same like general religious climate that produced Seventh-day Adventism. Um, so because there was a lot of fervor in there, and a lot of people were rejecting traditional denominations. So Charles Taze Russell um, was dissatisfied with the religious beliefs of all the churches in his day, so he started a Bible study movement to um, basically try to get to the original teachings of the Bible. And as he went along, he started to discard a lot of classical Christian beliefs, such as the Trinity and the deity of Christ. and he started, and also the eternality of hell. So Jehovah's Witnesses are annihilationists, um, and these were all, controversial in that day, and continues to be in this day. But Charles Taze Russell was a very charismatic figure. So when he preached, people gravitated towards him, and he attracted a large following. And he started to have like these. The best way to describe them are delusions of grandeur. He never quite claimed to be a prophet like Joseph Smith or Ellen G. White did, but he may as well have had, because he said things such as that, you cannot truly understand the Bible unless you read my writings. If you read the Bible by yourself, you'll be led astray. If you read my writings, you'll come to the correct understanding of the Bible. So Charles Taze Russell, one of his most famous statements was that the world would end in 1914. So we all know that didn't happen. And Charles Taze Russell died a couple of years later in 1916. At that point, Judge Rutherford succeeded to the leadership of the Bible student movement, and he's the one who renamed the group to its present name, the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's the one who organized it into a coherent organization rather than just a loose group of affiliated Bible study groups. And he distanced himself from Charles Taze Russell's 1914 prediction and reinterpreted it. He did it the same way Adventists did with 1844. He said, "Well, it's not that Jesus would come back visibly at this time to bring about the end of the age. He actually came back invisibly, and he's now seated on the heavenly throne, and you cannot see him, but he is ruling now, and he's going to make that manifest at some other later point down in history." The Jehovah's Witnesses did attempt to predict the end of the world a couple more times, once in 1975, another time in 1998. Those didn't happen. And I think they learned their lesson, because they're not trying to predict the end of the world anymore. But the fact that they did it 3 times and got it wrong each and every time is, I think, one of the greatest signals to the falsity of their organization.
All right, now this one is also from Shane. How many connections to Freemasonry have you found researching Mormonism or other New Age religions?
Yeah, so this is one of the interesting topics about a lot of the new religious movements. A lot of them do have a Masonic connection, either directly or indirectly. And Mormonism happens to have a very direct connection to Freemasonry, because Joseph Smith was a Mason. And this is not even anti-Mormon propaganda, because it says so right on their church website. Like if you go to the LDS Church official YouTube channel, they have a whole video on how Joseph Smith was a Freemason, and how how the temple rituals have a lot of commonalities with Freemasonry. So they admit that there are parallels between the Latter-day Saint religion and Freemasonry. They even say that to this day, their church allows its members to be Freemasons, which is, as you know, is the opposite of what Catholics believe. You can't be a good Catholic and be a Freemason. Membership with the Freemasons will earn you an excommunication. With us, but for them, it's a-okay.
Last one here from Patrick. So Kwaku references St. Ignatius's letters to the Ephesians as proof of the great apostasy, when Ignatius admits that Ephesus has remained faithful to the apostles. Can you maybe corroborate that and elaborate further?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. So I'm just gonna pull up right now what the article that I wrote in response to Kwaku. So he quoted a section from the epistle to the Ephesians, and it says this: "The last times are come upon us. Let us therefore be of a reverent spirit, and fear the long suffering of God, that attend not to our condemnation." Now, I think if you look at the chapter in its entire context, there's nothing at all there about an apostasy. In fact, I'm quoting, I believe, the Lightfoot translation of it. Um, Actually, no, it's the ANF translation. And actually, the funny thing here, I said the last days are come upon us, but that's a mistranslation. In the original Greek, it just says the last days. So Ignatius isn't even necessarily saying that we are arriving at that moment. He's just saying, this is something that you should be thinking about. Saint Ignatius is telling the Ephesian church, meditate upon the last days, because it could arrive at any moment. You don't know when, will.
All right. Let's see. I think there's actually one more on here. Here it is. Well, no. I'm sorry. Here. How much money does a typical LDS family give over their lifetime, and where do the elders invest that money?
You know what? I don't really do a whole lot of research on this particular topic, so
Mm,
my information
yeah.
is a little bit shoddy.
Sure.
But I do know one thing for a fact, that the LDS Church has a very a big bank account, and there are billions of dollars just stored up in that account. And this was only known to us fairly recently. Like I think it was disclosed a couple months ago, right around the time that the coronavirus pandemic started,
Hmm.
and it created a bit of controversy within the church because people were questioning, well, why do you have all this money? And the church said, well, this is a rainy day fund. We're saving it for an emergency. And then the people just responded, we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Wouldn't this qualify? So that money is sitting there, and it's supposed to be like for an emergency, but they didn't tap into it for whatever reason.
Okay. Let me also ask one last one. This isn't coming up here, but I want to ask it just for my own understanding. Has there been a change when it comes to the way the Mormon Church has perceived the blacks? From what I understand, there seems to have been a change there. Can you maybe shed some light on that?
Yeah, so one of the most well-known facts, I mean, there are many well-known facts about the LDS Church, but one of those well-known facts is that until 1978, they did not admit blacks to the priesthood. Um, and it's funny to me how the civil rights movement took off in the 1950s, and it accomplished its goal of desegregation and appealing the Jim Crow laws in 1968. So, like, the LDS Church was actually a full decade behind the curve when it came to civil rights. Like, the exclusion of blacks from the priesthood actually lasted 10 years longer than Jim Crow. And of course, there's that classic belief um, that exists in some older LDS literature, although I don't know that they would still hold to this today, that black skin is the result of not siding with Jesus and Elohim
Hmm.
when Lucifer rebelled against God.
Was that
So
ever
those were just supposed
officially
to remain
taught?
neutral. Not to my knowledge. Like, it was something that Latter Day Saints in the past may have held to. I don't know that they still teach it now. I think it's one of those things that like might be held within certain sectors of the Latter Day Saint world, but has never been canonized as official doctrine.
Hmm.
There are many Latter Day Saint beliefs like that. The Adam God theory is another example. Like,
Mm.
some apostles and have taught it, and Brigham Young taught it, but it was never official church teaching. I mean, we have parallels to that in Catholicism, like
Hmm.
Mary as co-redemptrix or
Hmm.
mediatrix of all graces. Like, that's not official doctrine. Many Catholics believe it, and many Catholics don't.
Hmm.
You know.
Sure. Well, I don't see any more chat questions, so let's go ahead and wrap it up here. Did you have any concluding thoughts
Yeah.
or last points that you wanted to bring forth to the table here
All
before we end
right.
the stream?
So generally speaking, all of the new religious movements will assert some form of the great apostasy theory. So I think that a Catholic discussing religious matters with whether it's a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or a Seventh-day Adventist will want to focus in on that specific belief and show that no, there is not a great apostasy. We see continuity in the succession of the church, and God's people have always been around, and they've always taught the gospel. And it's very important to also know what you believe. So many of the same objections that Catholics receive from Protestants are the exact same objections that they'll receive from these new religionists. So, be prepared to defend all the same doctrines of the church that we would debate Protestants on, whether it's, the necessity of church authority, of the papacy, of the Marian dogmas, purgatory, etc.
Excellent. Well, again, Louis, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to have you back on to talk about, there's quite a few topics that I want you to come back on if you have time, but I especially want to talk about textual criticism in reference to the Quranic textual criticism, if you're interested.
So that is an ongoing research project of mine. And I am constantly updating my references on that, so we could certainly have a discussion on that topic. Just bear in mind that specific elements of that may be revised as new information
subject to
comes
change along. I mean, that's the case with
Exactly.
everything. That's the case with everything we study. So I hear you.
That's true. Yeah. One last thing. So we do have another I believe it's June 2nd that we're going to have Jackson Washburn on here.
Yeah.
To discuss more topics pertaining to Mormonism. So anyone who is interested in the material we covered, tune in for June 2nd.
Excellent. Yeah, that's going to be fun. All right. Well, hey, I'll be in touch with you off the air. We'll see if we can set up a date for an Islam podcast. I don't know if you wanted to take this one. Charles was really wanting you to answer it. If you want to do it really quickly before we end the stream.
Okay.
Evolution. Is it a new religion? Do you believe there was an Adam and Eve? Did you believe in evolution?
I just find it interesting that Charles refers to evolution as a he. I didn't even know evolution self-identified as male.
Oh, no. I think he's asking, you're the he. Do you believe you're the he? Yeah.
Sorry. I missed
you're the he.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Adam and Eve definitely existed. Pope Pius XII said in Humani Generis that this is a non-negotiable article of faith, that there was a historical Adam and Eve and we're all descended from him. That being said, could Adam and Eve have evolved from prior life forms? The Catholic Church doesn't stake a position on that, and we're free to disagree. I'm personally at least somewhat amenable to the intelligent design movement. I spent years researching arguments for intelligent design, and I think they have a lot of good points to make. I especially recommend the works of Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer. So while I'm not making a definitive statement on the matter, I would say that it is a discussion worth having, and it should be something that is encouraged.
Yeah, and we do actually aim to tackle that one in a future show, so everybody stay tuned for that. But go ahead.
Just don't have me do it, because it's not my area.
Right. We might have a debate on it between two guys and just watch them go at it. We'll see. But anyways, we will be tackling it in the future. Once again, thank you for coming on. Always a pleasure.
Yep, it is my pleasure as well. God bless.
Everyone, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Till next time, God bless you all.